We are continuing with our journey introducing Matthew's Gospel, and I need to answer a question that people have about Matthew's Gospel before we begin. And the question is, why is Matthew so hard on the scribes and Pharisees and the Sadducees? Why does he call them a brood of vipers? That's terrible language to use. In order to answer that before we get into the text at all, I need to go over some of the things that were happening in the world at the time so that you have the background to understanding what Matthew is thinking about. But this time only to 6 or 7 BC, which is the time of Jesus' birth. We'll explain that another time. And then you have the death of King Herod in 4 BC. And that was the time when the angel told Joseph to take the child and his mother back to Israel. So naturally people say, but how can Jesus be 2 or 3 years old BC? And the reason is that the calendar that we use that says that this is 2017 is wrong. The man who made the calendar was a monk who lived in the 4th century. His name was Exiguus, wherever he got that from. And he made one mistake only, trying to put a number of different ancient calendars together. And the mistake he made was on the date of the death of King Herod. Instead of Herod dying in 4 AD, he died in 4 BC. So because of that, we have this anomaly that's in the lineup. Once Jesus gets back to Israel, there's then approximately 27 years of the private life of Jesus. And from 27 to 30, approximately, we have the public ministry of Jesus. Okay. Now, it's from this point that I want to pick up with Matthew's Gospel. I needed to say the bit about the early part because that will come into chapter 2 of Matthew. Now, 30 AD, you have the martyrdom of the Son of God. The passion, death, resurrection, ascension, and Pentecost happening there. And around that time, Saul of Tarsus was approximately 20 years old, just to sort of put something into the picture for you. I love putting pieces of jigsaw together, do you? And if you want to be good at scripture, you need to be good at jigsaw puzzles, or else become a detective. Because what you find is that the pieces of evidence are dotted all over the place. And if you haven't got the patience to go and pick up a piece of evidence there and put it in there to fill your picture, you may never get the answers to some of the questions people ask about the Gospels. After the death and resurrection of Jesus, between 30 and 36, you have the evangelization of Israel, that's Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then they went further out into what was later on, in later history, called Europe. It wasn't called then, it was Asia Minor and so on. So you had the missionary work in Asia Minor, Greece, the east, the south of Israel. So the church spread north, east, and south. It spread in all directions, against all the odds. Everybody thought that with the death of Jesus, it was all going to disintegrate. It only began. So, in 36, first martyr, Stephen dies. And soon afterwards, you have the conversion of his murderer, Saul, Paul. Okay, so they're the very early days. Now, between 36 and 41, you then had the persecution of the Sanhedrin, very important for Matthew's Gospel. Very important. He speaks about it several times. But you'll find the details in Acts chapter 4 to chapter 8. And then in 41, we have another major event, which is the martyrdom of James of Zebedee, John's brother. This is the second Christian to die and the first apostle. Okay. The second Christian that's mentioned, I should say, and the first apostle. Okay, and then afterwards you have the Sanhedrin persecuting both Peter and Paul, and both of them have to get out of Israel. So that brings you up to Acts chapter 12. Okay. You will read about this in Matthew chapter 10 from verses 17 to 20 and Matthew 23 from verses 33 to 36. I need to slot this in here because Matthew has these events in his mind as he's writing. And he presumes that when he mentions them in chapter 10, that you actually know what he's talking about. But I find that many Catholics project the persecutions mentioned in chapter 10 right up even into the 20th and 21st century. There may be some basis for that, but that wasn't in Matthew's mind. So we just need to know what was he thinking at the time he wrote the Gospel. So now let's move out into the Roman Empire. And between 41 and 54 was the reign of Claudius in Rome. And during his reign, there was famine in the empire and famine in Jerusalem as well. And that's mentioned in Acts chapter 11. Okay? And during that time, you also have Paul's missionary journeys, enormous amount of activity going on. But something very quiet was going on as well. And that is that many Christians who moved out of Israel actually went to Rome and they evangelized Rome. And they set up the church in Rome long before Peter or Paul arrived. Nobody knows who they were, but they were very effective. That's all we know, is that they were very effective. Because of them, Rome actually became the center of Christianity. It's amazing. And God was using very little people. So the next major event that's mentioned is in the year 48 to 49, which was the Council of Jerusalem. And you find this in Acts chapter 15. And major decisions were made in Acts chapter 15. Perhaps you know that there's a group of Christians from all denominations working for a long time to bring about the Second Jerusalem Council, which will make major decisions for the future as well. Now, from approximately the time of the Council of Jerusalem, a new thing happened. It was stirring all the time in Israel, but it only came to the surface, and that is that false messiahs appeared. And these men were all military and they were all revolutionary, and they were stirring up the people to revolt against Rome. Now, why is this significant? Because when you meet the reaction of the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees to Jesus, they were expecting him to be a revolutionary. They were expecting him to be a military leader. They were expecting him to set up a revolt against Rome. And when he refused to do it, because he was only interested in the kingdom of God, they took a most frightful revenge on him in his passion. And the punishment they gave him in his passion has to do with what they wanted from him and what he refused to give them. It was their disappointment in him. But the other false messiahs actually succeeded in getting the people to revolt against Rome. Now, that was a bit like some small little person revolting against somebody mighty. And so the might of Rome decided to come down on Israel. And in 65, when they revolted against Rome, Vespasian, the Roman general at the time, who became emperor, arrived in the north of Israel, and he began conquering Israel stone by stone, starting up in Galilee. The historian at the time was called Josephus Flavius, and he said that when Vespasian was finished, the Lake of Galilee looked as if it was full of blood. Now, what is significant about that? when you hear Jesus saying, "Woe to you, Chorazin," "Woe to you, Bethsaida," "Woe to you, Capharnaum," these were the little towns that he did so many of his miracles in around the Lake of Galilee. They were not expecting judgment, but judgment came upon them. And we learn in Matthew's Gospel why. So, throughout Israel, there was just social chaos and breakdown, okay? And when Nero committed suicide in 68, Vespasian went back to Rome to become emperor, and he left Titus to finish the job in Israel. And Titus arrived in Jerusalem just in time for Passover in 70 AD. Now, Titus also eventually became emperor, okay? But when Titus arrived in Rome, he did the most dreadful things. He caused the abomination of desolation in the temple. And what did he do? He sacrificed priests on the altar of God instead of animals. And he desecrated the Holy of Holies and eventually burnt the temple to the ground. Okay. So the great temple of God that had been one of the wonders of the world was suddenly, utterly and completely destroyed. You will hear Jesus telling them about that in Matthew's Gospel. He said to them, "Your house," that means your temple, "and your nation will be left desolate." That means utterly destroyed. And Jesus said, it's because you would not accept either the visitation of God or the message of redemption. These are the consequences. Okay, so these dreadful events happened, and after that, between 70 and 100 AD, there was still a lot of revolt and social chaos in Israel. And so the Emperor Trajan decided in 100 AD to start expelling the Jews from Israel. And it was completed in 130 AD. No Jew was allowed to live in the land of their ancestors. That was called the final solution to the Jews. And that language was picked up by Hitler in the 20th century when he tried to eliminate the Jews also. This is terribly important for understanding Matthew. So, between 30 and 60 AD, there was the evangelization of Rome. And then Nero set fire to Rome in 64 AD, and he blamed that fire on the Christians. And so a terrifying 3.5-year persecution of the church in Rome broke out. Now, when you read in Matthew's Gospel about the storm on the lake, Matthew doesn't use storm language when he's talking about the storm on the lake. What he says is that a seismos broke out. And a seismos is an earthquake. And he's using the storm on the lake to explain this terrifying persecution of the church in Rome, because during this persecution in 65 AD, they martyred Peter, and then in 67, they martyred Paul, the two great witnesses to Christ in the New Testament. Now, 4 of the apostles were dead. The church felt we're going down. And that's why you get this emphasis in the story on the storm on the lake. Lord, we're going down. And it's all of these events that actually stimulate Matthew to write a gospel. And in 68 AD, Nero committed suicide, and there was a great calm. That's exactly the emphasis that Matthew gives you in the story of the storm on the lake. Okay, so you go to Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 to 8, and you hear of wars and rumors of wars and famines and earthquakes, and you hear about the death of the nation and all the rest of it. You will understand that the Christians thought that the final glorious coming of Jesus was now. Everybody else thought it was the end of the world. And Matthew decided to write a gospel. Why did he write the gospel? He wanted to steady the church. When when the apostles said to Jesus, "Lord, we're going down," Jesus nearly said to them, "Going down where?" He was in the boat. And Matthew wants to tell the early Christians, Jesus is with you. You're not going down, not when he's in the boat. And so he wants to steady the Christians, and he also wants to tell them to prepare for the long haul into the future. You're going on a long journey.
Where is your faith?
Yeah, certainly Christians are dying in huge numbers now, and some of our foundational members are dying as well. But that does not mean the church is dying. The old era is dying. And we have terrible apocalyptic events happening all around us. But the new era of a new and divine holiness has already begun. And the Lord has laid down all the foundations, and the two eras are beginning to separate. But there are many, many people on this earth as I speak who think that all the signs are for the end of the world. No. And that's why I say to everybody, go back to the Gospels. Go back and superimpose everything that's happening today on what was happening then, and you will realize an old era is dying and a new era is being born. Hence you have got all this chaos and you've got all this disintegration that's happening, but something completely new and wonderful is actually beginning. If I give you all of these apocalyptic events, and the death of the temple in Jerusalem and the death of the nation of Israel, then I can answer a question that everybody asks about Matthew's gospel. And the question is, why was Matthew so hard on the leadership? Why did he call them a brood of vipers? Well, in chapter 7 of Matthew's gospel, Jesus said, "By their fruits you will know them. You will know that a tree is an orange tree if it produces oranges." You can say anything you like about it, but the tree has proved itself to be an orange tree. If the scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees and the Sanhedrin allowed the entire nation to be disintegrated during their watch, and allowed the temple of Jerusalem, one of the great wonders of the world, to be destroyed, allowed their religion to literally fall apart, then he would call them a brood of vipers. A brood of vipers means a nest of snakes. Okay, and you do know in the Bible that the snake is the image of the devil. He calls them devils because they actually brought hell into Israel. And so it helps you to actually understand a little bit better the confrontations that Jesus has with these men as he goes through his ministry. And they are trying to extinguish the light. They are trying to dampen down this new revelation. They are trying to say, no, God would not visit us, that the Son of God would not walk in our midst. What is wrong? What is wrong with them? These were the very people who were representing God. If you're blind, you cannot see. If you're deaf, you cannot hear. If your heart is hardened with sin, it won't soften to the mercy of God. And that was what Isaiah had said in Isaiah 6:9. And Matthew will quote this for you. They will see and never see. They will hear and never hear, because these people have blinded their eyes, they've deafened their ears, and they've hardened their hearts for fear they would be converted and live. And so you're looking at an enormous tragedy, which is the death of religion. Now, here's another question. Why would Matthew tell you these stories in a book that's not meant for these people? Why would Matthew write these stories for Christians who are going into the future? Why would Christians need to know about this priesthood that had become rotten and disintegrating? Why would he do it? It's because he wanted to give a solemn warning to Christian leaders of all generations in the future that this could happen to you, that Christianity could disintegrate under your watch. Now, as I say those words, will you look at what's happening in the Western world and disintegration that's all around us, and the loss of faith, and the walking away from the lifestyle of Christ and the morality of Christ. When Matthew wrote those words and gave that solemn warning to leaders, he actually meant it. And he had a very good reason for saying it. So let me just give you just a few reminders from the gospel itself. For example, he was trying very hard to warn Christians not to go down the same route. So, for example, in Matthew 24, verses 45 to 51, you have a solemn warning to the Christian leaders, and this is followed by the whole of chapter 25, which is Matthew warning Christians about the judgment that will come to them if they go down the same route. That God is the same whether he's talking to Jews or Gentiles. Thank you for listening. Slán agus beannacht dé libh. Goodbye. God bless you.